Hello everybody and welcome back to Rev Left Radio. On today's episode, I have on Donald Parkinson from Cosmonaut Magazine to talk about the historical figure known as Lyndon LaRouche. This was a person who ostensibly started off on the left as a Trotskyist, and over time created an organization that became increasingly Rectorist, increasingly cultist, and then ultimately explicitly reactionary and right-wing. And so Donald and I kind of trace the trajectory of LaRouche's political career and his organization, and we draw lessons on it for today because today in the left-wing socialist ecosystem, if you will, we're increasingly seeing this attempt by some revisionist MLs, I guess, to try to do many of the same things that Lyndon LaRouche and his organization tried to do, decades ago. This embrace of chauvinism, this embrace of patriotism, this tailing conservative social views, this sort of reductionist economistic workerism. It's all kind of here. And I think it's an incredibly important historical lesson for the left to learn today. Because if you've been on the left for the last several years, you've actually probably seen left-wing cults emerge. And so, as I mentioned in this episode, it's absolutely fascinating to go back throughout history, to see left-wing cults in the past, and then to live through a period of time in which you can watch in real time as they emerge, spin out and dissolve in various ways. And so it's a fascinating and timely and important discussion. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Donald Parkinson on Lyndon LaRouche. Enjoy.
Hey, I'm Donald Parkinson. You may know me from my previous appearances on Rev Left Radio, and I'm the editor-in-chief Cosmonaut Mag, and I guess you could call me an independent researcher of history and Marxism.
Yeah, well, welcome back. It's always a pleasure and an honor to speak with you and to learn from you. You and I have been trying to, figure out a topic to collaborate on for a while, and this finally kind of, hit our schedules both such that we could make it happen. So today we'll be talking about Lyndon LaRouche. And this is a really fascinating character that I've certainly heard about, but as I was telling Donald before we started recording, I've never personally invested the time and energy into kind of learning about him. Just he's sort of a fringe figure that I was aware of and kind of knew the gist of what he was and what he represented, but never really, appealed to me enough to dive into it. But after going back and forth with Donald and prepping for this episode, I found it to be absolutely a crazy story. Like reading some of these articles, I just break out laughing in my bedroom. Like, what the fuck? It's quite a strange tale.
Right. It's those things where it's like an onion. You keep peeling it and finding crazy stuff and peeling it more and finding even crazier stuff. And, it's when are you going to get to the core and find the kind of reason to all the insanity.
Yeah, exactly.
But, you just keep going deeper and deeper and it gets crazier and crazier with LaRouche.
Yeah, it really is quite the story. So today we're going to bring you that story. And Donald, before we get into the questions, what got you interested in this, and why did you wrote an article for Cosmonaut Magazine on him a few years back. So what was kind of the way you got into being interested in him?
Oh, okay. So back in the day, I knew a guy named Warren Goldner who was he was an old veteran of the New Left, and he kind of was a kind of left communist guy. And he had a website that I really liked reading. He had a lot of really good articles on Marxist theory. And I was kind of moving from anarchism to Marxism at this point. And I found out that Warren Goldner, when he was younger, was part of a group called the National Caucus of Labor Committees. And that he had left the group before they had what was called an infamous Operation Mop-Up. And so I decided that, I wanted to kind of read more about this group and figure out what they were all about. And why this guy was so embarrassed to mention that he had been part of them. And I had also kind of come across Lyndon LaRouche through conspiracy stuff. I've always been interested in fringe movements and just bizarre esoteric stuff. I don't know how to justify it, but I kind of just knew about him through the various conspiracy theories that had kind of seeped into popular culture from him. So this was maybe 7 years ago. I was looking into the National Caucus of Labor Committees, which was LaRouche's group. And I found it fascinating because it was an example of a group that started out, but was, they started out as what, from all appearances, seemed like a pretty orthodox Marxist group. Like, in fact, they kind of like made their claim to fame around being like more orthodox than like other Marxists of the New Left era. But they seemingly just quickly transformed into what is, pretty much undeniably a far right organization. But I was also interested in the fact that it seemed like a lot of their ideas from like their left wing era when they started as Marxists kind of like still existed in modified forms when they became a right wing group. And so I was kind of fascinated by how a group could go from being Marxist to becoming essentially what some people say are fascists. Like there's a lot of people who think that Lyndon LaRouche is basically a Americanized version of like Mussolini style fascism or even Hitler style fascism. And so the way that this group made this transition itself was interesting to me. And so when LaRouche died in 2019, he was already on my radar. So I wrote an article called LaRouche, A Warning for Us All, which was essentially a kind of warning about how like culty, sectarian, and authoritarian dynamics in leftist groups can essentially create the most ludicrous types of revisionism, I guess, and decline into just total far-right cultish crankery. And so I want to avoid that. That's one thing I've noticed is like a lot of leftist groups often develop these kind of culty tendencies. And so I wanted to kind of, maybe investigate how like the kind of sectarian approach of LaRouche to Marxism kind of was set him on the road to become this kind of far-right cult leader. So I wrote that article for Cosmonaut, and I kind of thought LaRouche at this point was just like his organization was still around. They'll even be like I've even seen them like tabling in Florida where I live. Like they're all over the place. But I kind of thought that they were just kind of declining into like a pure crank sect, and there was all kind of slowly die off. But recently there's been online and in various Marxist-Leninist spaces, there's been what I can only describe as a kind of revival of LaRouche's ideas. And I don't mean to say that like all Marxist-Leninists are guilty of this. Like I think the majority aren't. But there definitely has been this trend around people like Caleb Maupin, Jackson Hinkle, and Haas to basically like bring LaRouchian ideas into the left and to kind of fuse them with Marxism-Leninism. And increasingly, some of these characters have been getting like more and more attention in the media. Like that Jackson Hinkle guy was on Tucker Carlson. That guy Haas was on Chinese TV recently. And so in the world, like we already are part of like a world of fringe politics as Marxists. Like, yes, socialism is a little less fringe in the United States, but it's still like actual like Marxism, I still say is like pretty much fringe. And so it's easy to kind of say like, oh, this is just fringe, like crank stuff, and it's not really relevant. But like in the world of the left, like these kind of things are relevant because they can have, they can punch above their weight in influencing like the left and the small groups. And I think that, this kind of rise of LaRoucheism in the modern left that I've seen, I think it's something that should be combated. And, I think, and so part of, why I want to do this episode is just kind of to spread the word about, the real purpose and meaning of these ideas and, and that they're not at all something that we should be like trying to combine with Marxism. And that this is a nefarious group whose own intentions are not in line with those of principled Marxists.
Yeah. Amen. I agree with everything you're saying. And I also believe that it's our duty to combat this rising strain of reaction masquerading as Marxism and claiming to speak on behalf of Marxism, claiming to be the true purveyors of Marxism, and everybody who doesn't agree with their chauvinist takes or their settler nationalism or whatever it may be are fake Marxist or psyops or whatever. The conspiratorialism is there, the reaction is there, the sense of superiority and we are the true carriers of Marxism are there, even though in our current state, a lot of these people seem to have discovered communism within the last year or two. Certainly many of the fans of these egomaniacs and these people that are popping up on the ML left. But you said something in this article, which I really highly recommend if you want an overview of who LaRouche was, is your article in Cosmonaut, which I'll link in the show notes here. But I'm just going to quote a little bit from it because it's obviously talking about LaRouche and his little crew, but in a lot of ways, some of these main strains are still applicable in the sort of, Pat Sock or reactionary, pseudo-Marxist, milieus that are existing today. So you say in the article, quote, LaRouche was able to stake himself out in the New Left as the exception to the race-obsessed leftists who put a strong emphasis on anti-racism and third world liberation struggles. The LaRoucheites demonstrated a sort of conservative economism that would stay a central part of their ideology. Concessions to chauvinism became outright propagation of chauvinism as the organization developed. LaRouche's rejection of community control in favor of reactionary trade unionism distinguished the org from the beginning. And this is the last sentence that I'm going to read. The LaRoucheites posed themselves as the mature leftists in comparison to the degenerates who made up the New Left. And so this idea of mature leftist or true leftist versus degenerate leftist, and even the use of the term degenerate, in and of itself is something that's still here. The chauvinism, the dislike and the disdain of anti-racism struggles, or in the case of this newer crop, LGBTQ movements and activists. So I thought that was very interesting and very applicable to today. I just wanted to quote that, and I'll link to it in the article. Anything you have to say about that?
Yeah, I think that's kind of, when I wrote that article, that was kind of like my point was like, the LaRouchians like kind of embraced this almost like Leave It to Beaver style socialism where they would tell their followers to like cut their hair, like to not smoke grass and to listen to like Beethoven instead of rock music. And there was this like kind of attempt to like appeal to this idealized conservative worker, which you see a lot in the left today. Mm-hmm. And so, there was, we can get into this more when we talk about the history of the early days of the LaRouche movement. But like I said, there was definitely like tendencies there that you could see, and you could see how they could lead to like outright chauvinism. Yeah. And like, don't get me wrong, there is like an official anti-racist and like an official LGBT liberal ideology that communists do need to be critical of. Yeah. It's just that like, when you throw the baby out with the bathwater and actually like embrace chauvinism in the name of like reaching the working class, that's obviously something that we can't tolerate. It's just not what we're about.
Absolutely.
And I think LaRouche very quickly went down this road.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and zoom out now that we've kind of got the table set, and just assume that there's some people out there who have never even heard the name LaRouche. So for those that don't know, and kind of from a bird's eye view, can you just give us a quick sketch of who he was as a historical figure to kind of help orient our audience to the rest of the conversation?
Right. I'm going to kind of give the whole biography here. So basically, Lyndon LaRouche, he wrote under the name Lynn Marcus at first. He was born in a far-right Quaker family. And his father was basically this paranoid, right-wing John Bircher type who was constantly accusing the rest of the Quaker community of being like communist agents, because Quakers have always like been involved in like the peace movement and stuff. And in the LaRouche family were not, they were like right-wing, like pro-Cold Warrior kind of Quakers. And so, his father was kind of like what he would become, was just like constantly accusing everyone of being like a communist shill and stuff. So, LaRouche himself, he kind of rebelled against his upbringing by becoming a Marxist. So he's a Quaker. So he was a conscientious objector in World War II. And so he serves in the civilian public service. He gets bored with that, joins the army as a non-combatant, and he comes into contact with communists who are organizing within the army during World War II. And he gets turned on to the Das Kapital and starts getting into Marxism. And he works as a private and medical unit stationed in Calcutta. And there he makes connections with local communists. And it's a funny story. He actually suggests that they should stage an immediate uprising against the British colonial government. And they say, no, you're nuts. That's just ultra leftism. Mm-hmm. So he kind of gets disappointed with like the official communist parties and gravitates towards Trotskyism. And back home from the war, he joins the Socialist Workers' Party, which is the main Trotskyist party in the U.S. And the Socialist Workers' Party, they're the kind of party that had their members like go work in factories and do and like, industrialize themselves essentially to recruit factory workers. But LaRouche just hated that. He didn't want to be a factory worker. He couldn't take the pressure of working like a kind of manual labor job. So he actually ends up working as a management consultant for corporations. He has his own kind of management consulting firm. And this is actually interesting, like, because he kind of has like a first, like a really perfect view of how capitalism is actually working from the inside. So he does actually have some like knowledge about the actual like workings of modern corporations, which he kind of was able to use that knowledge. It kind of makes his Marxism like a bit more interesting and a bit more intellectually deep even. He was really interested in cybernetics, and he was interested in the idea of like using computer technology to like do planned economies and stuff, which is an interest I share.
Yeah.
And so he's kind of trying to like use his knowledge from being a business consultant to like modernize Marxism. And so they're actually he actually does kind of start out as like an interesting person. But when he's in the SWP, he's like a pretty minor character. He's not really like a big leader. He's mostly known for writing these long meandering bulletins that nobody read because they were just kind of just too out there for the average party member, I guess. He forms a 20-person split with another fellow Trotsky lord, and they come under the influence of this, was a particularly culty Trot group. I think they were implicated in a bunch of sex scandals and stuff later on in the 70s and 80s. And I think today the main continuer of that lineage is the World Socialist websites, less SEP people. But basically, like LaRouche kind of learns some of his later cult kind of techniques from the Socialist Labor League and Jerry Healy. He already had like a very like harsh and very authoritarian internal structure cult, and they use a lot of internal group, and they use a lot of kind of cult-like tactics to kind of get people to follow the central committee and devote a lot of time to stuff they normally wouldn't do. So there's already some kind of some of these like authoritarian bureaucratic centralist tendencies that LaRouche kind of learns from the Trotskyist movement. But he ends up he basically he's an egomaniac himself, and his little split ends up falling apart, and he goes off to do his own thing. And so this is like around 1967 with the New Left, and he starts teaching classes in Marxism at the New York City Free School. And he kind of rejects like a lot of what was trendy in the New Left. Like he wasn't really interested in Che Guevara or Herbert Marcuse. He was interested in Rosa Luxemburg and Marx's Capital and German idealism. Like he was really interested in like going deep into Hegel and Kant and Leibniz and all these German idealist philosophers. And so he's very much like a figure that a lot of the more like theory oriented Marxists in the New Left scene at Columbia kind of gravitate towards. And so, he builds up his reputation as this, this very intellectual and high-minded kind of Marxist theorist who's teaching Capital and Hegel to people. And so he kind of starts building up his own organization. And, this is the age of SDS. And at this time, SDS is, there's the Progressive Labor Party is working within SDS. And the Progressive Labor Party is, they were split from the Communist Party that at first like sided with China in the Sino-Soviet split. And so LaRouche is kind of like picking recruits from the Progressive Labor Party, because like one thing the Progressive Labor Party did was they did the whole thing of like sending their cadres to go work in the factories. And LaRouche, a lot of these college kids who were gravitating towards Progressive Labor Party, they didn't really want to do that. Mm-hmm. And so what LaRouche said was, well, you don't have to go spend your time working in the factory. What you need to do is spend time with me learning how to become the kind of intellectual elite that will be necessary for the future vanguard. And so he was able to like appeal to a lot of the more like kind of middle class intellectual Marxist types at Columbia by kind of emphasizing the intellectual side of things. And so he ends up building a kind of faction within SDS over time. And, in 1969, there's a big student strike at Columbia over the relation of the school to the Pentagon. And it is kind of like one of the biggest moments of the New Left. And LaRouche actually was able to kind of like make a name for himself as like a strike leader. And, apparently like all of his old comrades in the SWP were shocked when they saw LaRouche like speaking to large audiences of students and stuff, because they were just like, wait, like, this guy, he didn't talk to anyone when he was in the SWP. Now he's like leading students. And so this is kind of where the National Caucus of Labor Committees is formed. This is his own organization of the New Left. And, it's like very much a kind of ultra centralized, elitist organization. They develop this is, time period where a lot of people think revolution is imminent. There's a lot of people you had the Revolutionary Union form out of SDS, who was seen by the FBI as a threat to national security. You have all kinds of black nationalist and Chicano liberation movements forming. And there really is a kind of a feeling that revolution is imminent in the U.S. at this time, or at least it's something that can be entertained. And so LaRouche has this whole thing that their little vanguard needs to, be able to prepare to lead the country through the revolution. And he kind of has this Trotskyist, Luxemburgist theory that there's going to be a wave of mass strikes, and the LaRouche, the NCLC is going to be able to kind of swoop in and provide their leadership to the workers. And, they really kind of developed this sectarian and ultra centralist perspective, even though they're kind of, they're anti-Stalinist and stuff. They're very critical of the Soviet Union, but they're also critical of Trotsky. And LaRouche claims we have gone beyond Trotskyism. So
at this point, they're not even identifying necessarily as Trotskyists, but they're still Marxist, socialist, whatever.
Yeah. LaRouche kind of he actually thought that it's interesting enough. One of the things that caused him to break with the SWP was that he wanted to have a united front with the mainstream communists or the Stalinists or whatever. So he was actually he was always more open towards working with those types and other Trotskyists, I guess, at first. Interesting. But yeah, he decides to move, basically officially move away from Trotskyism. It's really Rosa Luxemburg who they're all looking at and talking about. And even till recently, the LaRouche movement was citing Rosa Luxemburg and stuff as an economist, which is interesting.
Yeah.
But it was really this kind of they saw the New Left as overly focused on race and gender issues, and they wanted to kind of promote a super workerist type of movement that would strictly focus on kind of this whole mass strike strategy. This also this leads to them in 1969, 70 or so, there was a teacher strike in Ocean Hill, Brownsville in New York City over basically the question of POC communities having control over their own schools. And the teachers union, led by Albert Shanker, which was kind of infamously conservative, basically they went on strike against this community control initiative. And LaRouche's group was able to kind of make its mark at this instance by taking they were the only group in SDS to support the teachers against the kind of POC-led community control initiative. And there was a lot of racial stuff going on with the teacher strike here, and so a lot of people kind of already kind of saw the NCLC as basically conceding to racism through this position.
Well, just to nail down this just a second. So there's a strike on the teacher strike, which in a vacuum is why wouldn't the left not support that? But it was basically to prevent people of color, specifically black people in their communities, having more say in the curriculum or in just the way the schools run. What exactly was the conflict there?
It was over how the schools would be run. Basically they wanted to have more control over their. It was mostly black and Puerto Rican communities, I believe.
Okay.
And there's a lot of research done about this strike because it's often used as the classic example of the old union-oriented left versus the new kind of liberation movement left. And so LaRouche's group really kind of made their name by taking the side of the teachers union here.
I see.
And the teachers union was also majority Jewish at this point, or largely Jewish, so there was kind of this thing of there's anti-Semitism against teachers union from the black community. And so this is something that LaRouche would later do even more heavily, is kind of use these ethnic stereotypes and conflicts to create outrageous propaganda and stuff. And so I feel this kind of this whole Ocean Hill Brownsville strike is interesting if you want to really look at the roots of where this kind of right-wing turn goes, I guess.
And there's also interesting echoes of I don't know, I don't want to make the connections too, overstate them, But there's like this little, like today we're dealing with this issue of like teaching history and critical race theory and how do we tell American history. And I saw some of the pictures from the teacher strike in your article. One of the white teachers is holding up something saying, "Stop teaching race hatred to children." And I assume that's like the reverse racism of teaching about the crimes against black people in our society.
Right, right.
Yeah, so there's a straight line culturally, through the culture war to kind of
exactly. It kind of just goes to show that like a lot of these like modern day like controversies around wokeness, quote unquote, are really like not that new.
Totally.
And,
yeah.
It's nothing new here.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so that's really like I thought that was really interesting, the whole Ocean Hill Brownsville strike, and that's something I'd like to research more, honestly, just because it seems like a really complicated like chapter of New Left history and labor history in general.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so now we have a basic picture of where he comes from, why he's an important figure to wrestle with in the first place, what some of the continuities of his ideas and the kind of cultural conditions and issues that were happening in his time bleed into today. And we talked about his various sects, breaking off from larger Trotskyist parties, eventually culminating in his own sect, the NCLC. And they're a ostensibly socialist Marxist organization, but now they're talking about going beyond Trotsky. They're drawing on figures like Luxemburg, but they're also kind of taking, in interesting ways, kind of some conservative cultural stances more than anything at this time. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a pretty good picture of how things are going. So the next thing that really happens is you have the LaRouche group. They're probably a bit more culty and overly centralized than the average Marxist group, but it's really Operation Mop Up where you see a disconnect from reality, and that's the first phase. And then the second phase is the Chris White affair. So I'm going to begin with Operation Mop Up. So Operation Mop Up is essentially, it starts as a rivalry with the CPUSA. The NCLC would go to their meetings and harass them, and they'd get thrown out. I'm sure, we may have encountered like Spartacus League people doing stuff like this. Like, this is something like sectarian kind of groups always do. They'll go to like the rival groups meetings and they'll denounce them and do some stuff like that. Like Red Guards Austin would do that kind of stuff. Yeah. So CPUSA accuses them of being government agents. And, it's possible, I can understand why they would see the possibility of that, but there's really no evidence that they were. Like, at this point, it's pretty clear, like they were acting on their own initiative, doing this on their own. And so there's already this rivalry between the two. And so the NCLC launches a national welfare rights campaign to rival the CPUSA's own campaign. So CPUSA reacts by kind of starting an anti-NCLC campaign and comparing them to the Klan, calling them racist, which, given their position on the strike we talked about earlier, we can see where that comes from. And I'm sure there's all those other weird stuff in their propaganda already. Mm-hmm. So this gives LaRouche the pretext to launch an all-out campaign to see that the, quote, CP cannot hold a meeting on the East Coast. We'll mop them up in 2 months, unquote. And so basically, the narrative that LaRouche was feeding to his members was that the CPUSA had been taken over by the CIA. And everyone jokes about how the CPUSA is 80% feds or whatever. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't, it's clearly there are federal agents who infiltrate the Communist Party, but LaRouche is basically saying that the whole organization is just completely taken over by the CIA, and that they're going to collaborate with the state to destroy the NCLC, which is the only organization that can lead the country to revolution and lead the world revolution. And so they do this whole Operation Mop Up thing. He says, I'm just going to read some quotes from LaRouche himself. He says, Operation Mop Up. The class struggle is for keeps, echoed LaRouche's call. We must dispose of the stinking corpse, the CP, the editorial said, to ensure that it cannot act as a host for maggots and other parasites, preparing future scabby Nixonite attacks on the working class. If we were to vacillate, we would be guilty of betraying the human race. Our job is to pulverize the Communist Party. So basically, they start coming up with this whole thing that the Communist Party is the biggest enemy and the biggest barrier to revolution, which is we see in the left infighting, the way some of these left groups fight with each other, they do kind of act like other leftist groups are the biggest enemy to them and the biggest thing in the way of like getting to revolution. And so that's basically kind of how they justify this whole campaign against the CP. But it's an extremely violent campaign.
Yes. So
they literally organize goon squads and all over the East Coast and go to Communist Party meetings and just beat people up. Here's a description of it from this book by Dennis King. Mob-up began in New York. It spread to Philadelphia, Buffalo, Detroit, and other cities. Attackers were sometimes brought out from out of town so their faces wouldn't be recognized. In several cities, they broke up public meetings and invaded leftist bookstores, beating anyone who tried to borrow their way. In New York, they ambushed individual CP leaders on the street. In Detroit, they administered a savage beating to a partially paralyzed left-wing activist on crutches. In Philadelphia, 25 to 30 NCLC members raided a meeting of the Public Workers Action Caucus. Quote, "The steps were a mass of blood," said a PWAC activist. "As soon as I walked out, I was hit by a pole," unquote. Although no one was critically injured in any of the attacks, several were hospitalized with broken bones and many required medical treatment for cuts and bruises. So that kind of gives you I just kind of wanted to read that to kind of give a depiction of what was going down here. So you've got these violent attacks on the Communist Party, and so what happens is actually really interesting is the SWP, LaRouche's old organization, decides to kind of bury the hatchet with the CP and actually form a united front to defend them from these attacks.
Right.
And so other Trotskyist groups actually join in.
A weird a moment of left unity against another ostensibly left organization that's literally physically attacking all of these organizations.
Right. It's really interesting how, because this is kind of like an anti-fascist united front in action.
Yeah.
Like all these different leftist groups are like putting aside their differences and forming like a common front to like form defense units against these just crazy thugs who are ostensibly left-wing, but it's like, so I thought about it. It's like, well, what did Mussolini do? Like he just started like squadristas that would go around like beating up like communists and socialists and breaking up trade unions and stuff. And that was really like the service he gave to the ruling class. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, yes, they might be like subjectively Marxist, but they're acting like Mussolini did, basically.
Right. Yeah, whether they're fascist or CIA plants or just asshole weirdo wreckers, functionally their effect is the same.
Right. And so I think it's interesting how they got the left to kind of unite against them. And so, you just have this insane campaign. The thing is like, like I said before, the LaRouche movement people, they were all pretty like kind of middle class, like nerdy types. And so they weren't really the tough types who were able to pull this off. So it really, they did some damage, but in the end, they weren't hardcore enough to actually like destroy the CPUSA like they wanted. Mm-hmm. But at this point, it's like anyone who stays with LaRouche at this point, it's like, it's kind of like a loyalty test. You go with some insane, ridiculous stuff and people are going to leave, but the people who stay and who go along with it are going to be more loyal because it's like kind of like a way of filtering out the people who aren't like dedicated enough to your leadership and won't like, go down the path that you're setting, basically, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see some interesting echoes of that in, not to talk about this organization too much, but in the Black Hammer situation.
Right. Like the whole Anne Frank thing, for example.
Exactly.
Like that was like a way of like creating a dividing line and creating discord.
Or even his Joker video, Anti-Antifa, when he was going against Antifa and making those insane Joker-fied videos. Like, if you're going to stand behind him the whole time and, like, and then after it's all over, you're like, I'm ready for the next shoot. What next video are we doing? Like, you are ride or die.
It's a loyalty test is what it is.
Yeah.
And that's, like, it also kind of reminds me of QAnon. Because it's like, we laugh at the insane stuff that, like, QAnon believers, like, say. But in the end, it functions as a way to kind of show your loyalty to the cause and say, I'm so dedicated to this cause that I actually do believe that the Jewish space lasers are going to, destroy, whatever. Like
exactly.
Or whatever insane stuff comes from, the 4chan or whatever, where all the QAnon stuff comes from. Like it works as a loyalty test and it forges a cohesive group that's not going to question orders.
Yeah. exactly. So
And that gets even crazier.
Yeah, go ahead.
So next step after the whole NCLC goes after the Communist Party and Operation Mop-Up is this whole adventure in psychology, because LaRouche is, he's Mr. Renaissance man intellectual. He claims to have been he claims to be a physicist, a psychologist, like an economist, and he kind of develops his own kind of psychological theories. And he has an article called Beyond Psychoanalysis from this era where he kind of claims to have overcome psychoanalysis and had developed a whole new version of psychology, basically around what's called ego stripping. And first there's this guy Konstantin George, who gets accused of being a spy for the Stasi and the KGB by the NCLC. He's a member of the NCLC. And so LaRouche claims that he recognized the symptoms that showed that he was brainwashed by the KGB, and he successfully deprogrammed him. And so this was kind of the first step in the whole brainwashing thing. And that kind of was accepted by the membership because they're already accepting Operation Mop-Up. But then there's another guy, Chris White, who was in Europe. I think he was in Germany. And he came back to the U.S. to attend an NCLC Congress, one of their big conventions. And he was showing, signs of just being, very out of it, basically. People who were there say that he did show signs of, psychological turmoil. He was not all there. Mm-hmm. But LaRouche basically says that now this guy is a programmed assassin that was programmed by the CIA and other intelligence agencies to assassinate LaRouche. And that anybody in the organization could be essentially programmed by these kind of Manchurian candidate type schemes. And this was actually before MK Ultra was exposed, which is interesting. Yeah. But I imagine you still did have discourse around brainwashing and stuff in the public. But basically, so LaRouche was claiming that through using computer science and stuff, because LaRouche was really into computers too, that they have basically figured out a way to program the brain using certain code words, and LaRouche had recognized the code words, and that he was able to use his psychological techniques to brainwash people who had been brainwashed. And so this is where everyone in the org is being put through these ego stripping sessions, which are basically just insane psychological torture, where LaRouche would just berate people for hours on end until they broke down and satisfied him. And I just want to say real quick that the idea of brainwashing itself is a very controversial idea, because it kind of comes out of the Korean War. There were these claims that U.S. troops who defected to the side of North Korea were basically just had been captured and brainwashed by the North Koreans, and that the Chinese had figured out how to do brainwashing. And so we all know about MK Ultra, which was itself a response to these claims that the communists developed brainwashing technology. But in the end, I think a lot of people, I think convincingly argue that the whole idea of brainwashing itself is just kind of this crazy anti-communist trope, and that it's, the idea that you can kind of break people down. That is true, and that's what MK Ultra did. They would use LSD and other stuff to break people down, but to put them back together to do whatever you want them to do is another story. And some people claim, there are, people who claim they did figure out how to do that, but that's all in the speculation. Because as far as we know, CIA never actually did successfully develop a brainwashing technique.
Right. At least not in the hard brainwashing, the maximum version of what we mean by that. Yeah.
Yeah, at least as far as we know.
Sure.
Maybe there is some declassified stuff, but I think the idea of brainwashing itself kind of comes from this misunderstanding of what happened in Korea, because these anti-communist State Department people couldn't imagine that good American boys would like on their own volition come to like see North Korea as like, you know, the lesser evil in the war.
Right, yeah.
They had to have some kind of brainwashing technology.
Almost like European colonizers, when they would come to settler colonialism in North America, there was constantly defections to the indigenous tribes.
Right.
And they were just perplexed. Like, we are the carriers of civilization. Why would you go over to them willingly? And very few came the other direction. So, yeah, they have to explain that cognitive dissonance.
Exactly. They probably had some theories about like, oh, they're doing magic to,
right, exactly,
hypnotize us or just some nonsense like that.
Right.
But yeah, so, you know, this whole Chris White affair, it basically puts the whole organization through this insane paranoid drama. And there is a book, the book, Lyndon LaRouche and New American Fascism by Dennis King has a bunch of information about it. But there's another book written by this guy, Kevin Coogan. It's called Smiling Man from a Dead Planet. It's like a 1,000-page long PDF that has like a ton of information on all this. And it's written by someone who was an ex-member. He's writing under the name Hylozoic Hedgehog, but his real name is Kevin Coogan. And he wrote a really interesting book on Francis Parker Yockey. Yeah. But so he has like this whole book called The Smiling Man from a Dead Planet, The Mystery of Lyndon LaRouche, that has like a whole breakdown of what could have happened during this whole Chris White affair. And it's really interesting to read and just see like how paranoid and out of control this was. Because they even like did like press conferences and stuff publicly. They had like public press conferences where they invite the public, and they would be like, look, the CIA is doing a brainwashing operation on our organization. Where's the public outrage? So it's like, we don't really know if LaRouche actually believed and that there was brainwashing occurring and that he was like preventing it, or if it was just like a purely cynical maneuver to just kind of like forge his cult. But there is a lot of information out there on it, and people are interested in going deeper into that. I recommend checking out that book.
So just to be clear, Chris White was a member of the...
Yes, he was a member of the National Committee, Caucus of Labor Committees, and he, at this point, they were an international organization. They had people in Germany, they had people in Sweden. They had they formed was called the European Labor Party, and they had some really interesting activities in Sweden, working with U.S. war deserters from Vietnam who were like refugees in Sweden, because Sweden was neutral. And so there was some connection with that as well. But yeah, in the end, he was an international member of LaRouche, of the NCLC. And he was kind of used as the example of like a brainwashed person who needed to be deprogrammed by LaRouche. And it just throws the whole organization into this paranoid conspiracy mode. So I think, and so I think like it's fair to say like at this point, like it's a cult. Yeah. Like the word cult gets thrown around a lot, but I think in this case, like it's just very appropriate.
Well, you have a centralized leader, and one of the things that these cult leaders do is begin representing themselves as the only true carrier of the torch for whatever it is that they're claiming to carry for. And then this whole idea of I have access to higher knowledge. I understand the KGB is after me, and they actually have this, this experiment they do to brainwash people, and now you're an agent of them. And it's like the fantasies of the cult leader, the absurdities, they can almost say anything, and the whole organization then becomes shaped around that individual leader's basically arbitrary whims or psychosis or whatever it is, and that is a fundamental feature of cultism.
Yeah, and it's all about this idea that like they are the one elites, the one vanguard that can save the world from the rising tide of fascism and imperialism and capitalism. Like they are the one group that has the esoteric knowledge, that has the intellectual skills to do it, and everyone else who disagrees with them, well, they're either CIA or KGB or whatever, and violence against them is justified. Anything against them is justified because they are holding back the revolutionary movement that only Lynn Marcus or Lyndon LaRouche can lead.
Right.
And so around like the mid 70s, the organization like starts to kind of change ideologically. And there's one thing they did that's pretty crazy. Like they keep saying that basically they get obsessed with Rockefeller and the Rockefeller family, and they think that the Rockefeller family is like going to unleash a fascist coup, and they're going to take over America and whatever. This fascist threat is inevitable. And so they tried to organize like their own kind of street gangs called the Revolutionary Youth Movement. And like the kind of stuff that they like say about black people in this period is just absolutely like offensive and insane. Like they would talk about Amiri Baraka, who was like he was like a poet who became a kind of Marxist Leninist leader. And they picked him as like number one like public enemy, and they basically turned him into like the worst like stereotype of like a black person, and used like him as like a way to kind of like launder all this like anti-black rhetoric. They had this whole thing about how you're going to lose your job to a quote unquote welfare loafer, a methadone crazed dope fiend, some gang member brought in from a ghetto neighborhood. Jesus. They were just attacking like black activists, like black CP members. So they really like basically like their newspaper would carry headlines such as CP turns rebels into N-words. They would come up with these like demeaning nicknames like Ron, Race Riot, Tyson. And they end up going into this kind of like anti-black stuff. And but at the same time, they're recruiting young black people to their revolutionary youth movement. And so they're kind of able to like say, oh, but we're not actually racist because we're working with black youth in the ghetto. But a lot of these people they recruited didn't end up staying. They didn't end up staying around because they were basically just like treated as like shock troops by the like mostly white like intellectual leadership. But they did get some people to stay, and they also worked in like these anti-busing campaigns. But in the end, like I think a lot of this anti-black racism was actually a test run for the anti-Semitism that they would indulge in. And they were actually able to like get like they were like a 1/4 Jewish organization. They had a lot of Jewish people in the organization, but they were able to kind of reinvent anti-Semitism in a way that would like make it so that they could get their Jewish members to like spew anti-Semitic propaganda, giving them like a kind of plausible deniability, right? And this is like in this period, they're also like they're basically saying that the Communist Party and like left liberals are going to like team up with the Rockefellers to unleash this dictatorship, this fascist dictatorship. So they need to form a popular front, basically with the right, like the far right, in order to fight fascism. It's kind of like what you see with some of these like patriotic socialist types who think that like Marxists need to form an alliance with MAGA to fight the true fascist Joe Biden, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So it's basically this idea that like the liberals are the real fascists and the far right reactionaries are actually the anti-fascist, which is how you get this like everything up is down, down is up type worldview, where you can kind of just like create this whole intricate ideology where you'll get people to just believe absolute absurdities because within the context of this ideological system, it all makes sense. So in 1975, the NCLC starts reaching out to the KKK, and they believe that Rockefeller is planning a fascist takeover using the liberals and the New Left, and the KKK are going to be the working class allies who are going to help fight the fascists. And it's first sold as like this tactical alliance, but in the end, like it's just a total ideological shift to the far right. So and there's another guy, Willis Carto, who was part of what's called the Liberty Lobby. And Willis Carto was a disciple of Francis Parker Yockey, who was kind of like one of the first big like post-war fascist figures. So this guy Willis Carto starts working with the LaRouchians, and that kind of puts them even further into the pure far right sphere. LaRouche starts romancing his future wife Helga Zepp, who is now basically the leader of his organization as it exists today. She's like a German woman. And when she gets involved, like apparently the group really starts taking like a strong nationalist turn. They just completely abandon like discussion of Marxism and frame everything around like good American patriots versus the financial oligarchy.
You said in your article they even dropped the term comrades and started using the term patriots to refer to each other.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Like, and that's just like you see all these like people trying to like reinvent Marxism as like American patriotism today, and it's just like are they just like doing LaRoucheism? Like,
Yeah. It's going to lead to the same place, the dustbin of history.
Right. It's going to lead nowhere, but
Exactly.
like you're going to look really dumb while you try it.
And so, exactly, the question is, to what extent was LaRouche and his organization embraced by the right? Was it just embraced by a few elements of the fringe far right, or was there ever any more absorption into a mainstream or even maybe a little right of mainstream movement? Or did they kind of isolate themselves from both the right and the Marxist left?
Yeah, so basically, it's they started getting in bed with the Reagan administration later on, basically.
Okay.
And so I think you could say that in the 80s they did have some success in courting the mainstream right.
Okay.
And they actually tried to do entryism in the Democratic Party in the 80s. And in Illinois they actually had some minor success that kind of created like a whole crisis in the Democratic Party in Illinois, which is pretty there's a pretty detailed exploration of their adventures in the Democratic Party in the Dennis King book. But
they ran within it to destroy it or to move it to the right, or what was their ultimate goal?
I'm not, I think it might have been the kind of be useful idiots for the Reagan administration in a way. Like I think it was I'm not sure exactly what they were trying to do with the Democratic Party, but they were using it to get more of a public profile.
Because even to this day, LaRouche's Wikipedia profile, it has him like political affiliation, the Democratic Party, and it just
he
weird.
kind of like did this whole thing like we're going to like organize conservative Democrats,
I see.
So there's that, and it's really like in this like period in like the mid to late 70s too, when he first starts out like reaching out to military officers and sending like communiques to them, basically saying that the Carter administration is going to destroy the Constitution, so we should do a military coup, basically. Like, it's very bold, like I'm just going to like reach out to a bunch of military guys and tell them to do a coup for me.
It's wild.
And that obviously didn't work, but it does start this tradition of forming relationships with intelligence agencies, which we'll get into more. And it's also, you see a change in the ideology completely. Like Marxism is less and less an actual thing that they even talk about. And now, like, it becomes this total esoteric doctrine where basically there's this thing he writes, Secrets Known Only to the Inner Elites. It's basically this pamphlet where he basically, like, portrays history as this battle between two tendencies, an oligarchical tendency that follows from Aristotle, and the humanist tendency that follows Plato. And so now, like, all history, instead of class struggle, is a struggle between followers of Aristotle versus followers of Plato.
Yeah.
And it really, this theory ends up working wonderfully for LaRouche, because he can always say that, like, X government that I'm forming intelligence ties to is, like, itself split between the humanists and the oligarchs. And so you can kind of like use this ideology to like justify anything, because anything could be like part of this secret conspiracy, right?
So it was a Plato versus Aristotelian dissection of the world, and they're obviously on the side of the Platonists against the Aristotelian whatever, and they kind of shove everything from environmentalism to drug use to anything else into the Aristotelian world order or whatever. Yeah,
it's like because like the main enemy is the Queen of England, and so for it really comes down to the Anglos for LaRouche. Like there was a lot of like anti-Semitism, but like he tried to use like plausible deniability and stuff, the anti-Semitism. But really, what he would do was he kind of like reinvented anti-Semitism, where the Anglos take the place of the Jews, basically. So it kind of like creates this like structure of a theory where like you have all the tropes of anti-Semitism. There's like a shadowy oligarchy that's controlling the banks and everything, but it's really the Anglos. And there actually like is like a history, I guess, of like anti-Semites like using like a British connection with the Jews as a kind of trope.
Strange, yeah.
But the way it works is essentially like you get all the like conspiracy theory, like paranoia of anti-Semitism, but without the direct like anti-Semitism that would completely discredit LaRouche to like mainstream like right-wing allies.
Right. And when actually, it makes me remind when Jackson Hinkle's dumbass tweet recently about I'm uniting Marxist and MAGA, and if you're not on this train, you're going to become irrelevant or whatever. What did he say? Oh, he said I'm uniting the Marxist and the MAGA against the globalists. So like there's already this capitulation to right-wing rhetoric and the notion of globalist, which from a Marxist perspective is a mystification of, imperialist, capitalist, whatever, but it opens the door to that anti-Semitic conspiratorialism.
Right. It's just like the whole idea about like the problem in the world is that this shadowy elite controls the banks. Yeah. Exactly. When has that ever led anywhere good?
Right. Right.
And it's just not a materialist explanation, So someone like LaRouche, who prided himself on being a Marxist economist who developed a theory of how capitalism works and everything. He had a book called Dialectical Economics. I actually did try to read it a few years ago. It was just way too into esoteric German idealist stuff for me to understand at the point. Mm-hmm. But so he's, he makes a name as this Marxist theorist, and then he just totally embraces a bunch of nonsense. And, instead of Marxism, he kind of takes up this corporatist program where instead of labor versus capital, it's industrial capital needs to ally with the labor unions under the leadership of the NCLC elite to basically enforce a dictatorship against finance capital and any kind of political opposition. And they call it Hamiltonian economics. Alexander Hamilton becomes the big, great economic thinker that LaRouche thinks America needs to go back to. And so he kind of argues for this really state heavy centric, kind of state capitalist corporatist model that would put the country into this state of total mobilization for War of Britain, which is supposedly the home of the global Zionist financial oligarchy. And then the Soviet Union is next. It's actually it's funny, this guy Dennis King quotes a LaRouche pamphlet from back then that says that Hitler's mistake was going after the Soviet Union instead of Britain first. And so, the LaRouche-types are going to do it right, even though they're anti-Nazi or whatever, but they're going to do it right and go after the British first.
And then the Soviet Union, you said?
And then the Soviet Union, they literally have writings where they were talking about how they needed to basically use microwave radiation guns to destroy the Soviet Union and then rebuild it.
So it's very interesting how this sort of zombie Trotskyism can develop into this Cold Warrior, neoconservative.
Right. It's like the Shachtmanites almost.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it's total shift to the right. In that sense, they're just completely embracing, this idea of uniting industrial and financial capital, which is kind of against industrial capital and labor against financial capital, and this idea that it's just finance capital that's the problem. It becomes super anti-environmentalist. Environmentalists just want to prevent the full unimpeded growth of the productive forces. And it's interesting because it's the 1970s, right? And there's kind of this deindustrialization of America going on. Mm-hmm. You have factories going overseas. So I think LaRouche did kind of have his finger on the pulse, and he did kind of see what was happening economically. And I could think maybe this was his response to the deindustrialization of the country was well, now Marxism isn't going to work anymore because the industrial working class is getting gutted. So what we need to do is unite with the industrial capitalists and reindustrialize the country.
Right.
But yeah, that's kind of where they are ideologically by the 80s, which is when they start forming an alliance with the Reagan administration.
So let's pause right there just to catch everybody kind of up. And I'm just kind of sketching out the chronology of the shift here. So starting as this sect from a Trotskyist party, we talked about going beyond Trotsky, etc. And then there's this mop-up campaign. So it goes from a ostensibly left-wing Marxist organization to one that is directly hostile to the CPUSA, but anybody else also on the new left or anybody they perceive as enemies. So first and foremost, the shift is finding enemies on the left and attacking them, often physically. Then there's a shift towards a doubling down or a getting into the cultism with the Chris White affair. So you see a movement towards Reckerism, then you see a movement towards occultism within the party, and then there is the explicit right-wing shift. Is that a chronologically accurate way to describe this?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Like as I said, like you can kind of see the beginnings of the right-wing shift with the Ocean Hill-Brownsville stuff,
Sure.
but it's like this intensifies as it goes on, basically.
Okay. And now we're in the 80s with the Reagan administration.
Yes, so basically LaRouche's plan is to try to forge an alliance with the Reagan admin. And, in 1974, they had founded this thing called the Fusion Energy Foundation. And, like, that's one of the things that LaRouche people are, like, famous for today is, like, their advocacy of nuclear fusion. Like, one of their big things is, like, promoting a crash course, like, Manhattan Project type thing to develop fusion energy. And, like, I'm not going to lie, fusion energy, if we could get it to work, like, that would be pretty cool.
Totally.
But, it becomes, like, this way for them to actually recruit scientists. Because they go to airports and table there and stuff, and they would like pose as just like oh, we're just advocates of fusion energy, trying to like promote this stuff, and we were able to recruit a bunch of scientists and stuff, get involved in this fusion energy promotion stuff. And then what ends up happening is that it becomes a way for them to recruit allies to Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars. Because basically a lot of these scientists end up working for the Reagan administration with the whole Star Wars thing, which is basically like, the whole idea is to like basically build like, laser beams in space that will make it so that it's impossible for the Soviet Union to do a first strike on nuclear weapons. And, so it's basically through this like promotion of fusion energy actually at first that LaRouche is able to like get connections with real scientists who then are able to get connections with the Reagan administration. And so the LaRouche movement becomes like really big promoters of the Strategic Defense Initiative and Star Wars. And so they basically just become complete shills for the United States military industrial complex.
So that, and you can even go online and look at videos of them, and their main sort of approach, especially around this time, is obviously, as you said, to be in airports. So they'd go in airports and they have their documents and everything, but they'd also dress, as we talked about earlier, respectably, quote unquote, right, in a tie with some nice slacks, right, tucked in shirt, looking very business professional-esque.
Right, exactly. They were able to like put on a public face of seriousness. So, like, people would work with them. They would say, oh, they have a lot of kooky views, but they are serious about getting funding for nuclear fusion energy and stuff. Mm-hmm. And so, they're able to use that as a kind of, and they're actually, they would like campaign on behalf of ex-Nazi scientists who were brought in for Operation Paperclip and like basically clean up their public image so that they could continue working in the State Department and stuff, which is pretty interesting. But, And then next came the, like I was saying before, like they were also working in the Democratic Party, but it's clear as an organization they're making overtures towards Reagan as LaRouche's personal favorite guy. Like he wasn't like a fan of the Republican Party as such, but he like saw a lot of potential in Reagan. And so, he didn't really have a ton of electoral success. They had some minor successes, but really what they kind of did was like cause confusion and discord in the Democratic Party, which, was kind of to the delight of like the right wing of the labor movement, because at this time LaRouche was also like making connections with the Teamsters officialdom, which were like connected with the mob, like people like Jackie Presser, and so he was basically working with the Teamsters leadership, and they had you had like reform efforts in the Teamsters to democratize the union, like Teamsters for Democratic Union. Basically, the LaRouche people like worked with the Teamsters mobbed up leadership to basically discredit these reform movements and try to shut them down, to basically keep the mob in control. All the while they're like talking about how we have to end the drug trade and the drug trade is controlled by the British and we're going to do the war on drugs, but do it right this time. And so you have the connections with the Teamsters or working in the Democratic Party, they're doing the fusion energy stuff. And they even had like press passes into the White House until their legal downfall. So they are able to kind of make overtures to people who do have power and do have influence. And, the anti-Semitism is getting worse, but they do mostly keep it like internally. But it's really like just insane homophobia becomes a big thing. Like in the 1980s, there was the whole thing about AIDS, right?
Yeah.
And there were like a lot of like conservatives who were like basically panicking about AIDS. So LaRouche in California had they had this campaign called Proposition 64 that was basically like it was a ballot initiative to put AIDS patients in concentration camps. Jesus. And if you read some of their literature from this period, there's like some really disturbing stuff. Like there's one point where they say that like random mobs who like beat up gay people are like, you know, acting rationally and stuff, and just really bad stuff. And you know, they go after Henry Kissinger and Roy Cohn. Obviously, Henry Kissinger is terrible and stuff, but like the way he acts as LaRouche is kind of like the ultimate symbolic Jew and homosexual, basically.
Yeah.
And they have these huge like public harassment campaigns that really just get really psychotic.
I think they got Kissinger in the airport once with his wife or something and accused him of being a pedophile.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is like one of the things they're most famous for. And it's like, you know, obviously we hate Kissinger. He's a terrible guy. But like, they're also working with Reagan administration spooks, you know? Yeah. So it's not principled at all.
Exactly. Like your object of the hate is right, but the reason you hate him is completely fucking off. You see that with the MAGA right today. Like sometimes they'll be like, you know, like fuck the FBI, and you're like, okay, tell me more. It's because they raided Trump's house and he should deserve the second term. It's like, oh god, there's a million reasons to hate the FBI, but those are none of them.
Exactly. It's totally like that. I guess this would be like a good place to kind of talk about like the actual connections that they made with intelligence agencies.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
So, you know, they start reaching out to the CIA in 1976. They had like talked about how they reached out to like military generals and stuff. But they start developing actual ties to the CIA. You know, some of the big ones are Admiral Bobby Ray Inman, worked as CIA deputy director from 1981 to 82 and received a flow of information from Lyndon and Helga Zepp. Dr. Norman Bailey, senior national security counsel, who told NBC that LaRouche had, quote, one of the best private intelligence services in the world, unquote. General Daniel Garam, who claimed that the LaRouchians provided sensitive information on Angola and Mozambique. And so basically, like, what you have here is, you know, LaRouche people would like have these. They had a big main office in New York City. I think they moved it to Virginia later on, and they would just have like people working in there up to like 16 hours a day, like, you know, doing research, making phone calls, doing fundraising, and, you know, doing a lot of like intelligence, you know, gathering stuff. And like they would do fund the operation is like they had all kinds of like basically scams, which is what would eventually get LaRouche in prison. Like they would do wire scams, credit card scams. They would like defraud like old elderly people of their life savings and transfer them entirely to the LaRouche organization. Like they put a lot of effort into all this fundraising and intelligence gathering, and, you know, it's a cult, so you're able to get people to like work their ass off longer than anyone else would. Mm-hmm. So they do get like an actual operation going. And there's some of the main people who actually like got them involved in the CIA are really crazy. There was this one guy, Mitchell Livingston Werbel III, a CIA contract agent and weapons manufacturer. He's basically as sus as it gets. Like, he literally worked for Batista as a security consultant, hatched a plot to invade Haiti. He is famous for developing a machine gun silencer that was a big hit with drug traffickers. He teamed up with the Libertarian Party and a bunch of mercenaries to invade the island of Abaco and set up a libertarian microstate, which failed, of course. Ran a counterterrorism training school, worked for Coca-Cola in Argentina to take care of threats. Ugh. And all kinds of stuff like that. Like, he's your ultimate, like,
the fuck,
sketchy, like, mercenary CIA guy, basically.
Yeah.
He was like, because the CIA, you know, they like to work with organized crime to do all their dirty work.
100%. Yeah.
And he's totally the kind of guy who had those connects with the CIA. And so he was a trainer. He would like train the LaRouchians in combat and stuff and help forge these connections with the CIA. Then there's another character, Roy Frankhauser, who they formed connections with. And he was basically had a long career basically being like every racist hate group in the US. And at one point he was even the Grand Dragon of the Pennsylvania Klan. And within the far right, he kind of developed a reputation as an FBI agent because it's like if someone's been in that many different like hate groups, it's like what's going on with this guy?
Yeah.
And but he was able to convince LaRouche that he was a genuine patriotic fighter who was basically like hung out to dry by the agencies he was working for. And he probably did have like some legitimate like security state connections, but he actually like fed a lot of false intelligence to the LaRouche people and like a lot of false information because it was kind of an easy job for him apparently. And but he actually like found contacts in the KGB as early as 1974. And so it's complicated because, it's easy to simply say that this group is a CIA op, right? Because usually when you find a group like this and they're super disruptive against the left, and you find these ties to the CIA, I guess it's pretty much, oh yeah, this is just a CIA op. But it was really more so that they were trying to act as a private intelligence agency. And they were trying to cultivate different allies and different intelligence agencies. But I will also add that while they did have connections with the KGB, they definitely leaned towards the CIA and definitely saw the CIA as like the main ally. But they did kind of have this way of trying to act as a conduit almost between different intelligence agencies. Like they would be able to tell their CIA guys, oh, so what do you want me to tell the KGB guys we know? Or the KGB people would be like, oh, tell the CIA guys this or whatever. So, it essentially acts as a kind of, like I said before, a private intelligence agency. And so you could say LaRouche is a CIA op, or LaRouche is a KGB op, but it's like, no, the LaRouche org is itself the op because it is basically a private intelligence agency with its own nefarious goals that is like working with these, very shadowy figures. And, they even like work with, the South African government. They form allies with the apartheid government. And they actually do like economic advising for some of these people in the South African apartheid government. That they're going to, they have this whole proposal to use contract labor to do like rapid industrial development, to then declare war on Mozambique, which at the time had a Marxist government. And they also did operations with the Guatemalan government that was, engaged in various genocidal operations with death squads and stuff. And so they very much like got involved with some of the ugliest parts of the imperialist world, system, basically.
Yeah. And the whole idea of being ops or being, CIA plants or whatever, the truth seems more something like the LaRoucheites moved in the direction of the CIA at a certain point, rather than from the beginning the CIA had their hooks in the organization and were kind of puppeteering it, right? Like they actually went to the CIA, not the other way around.
Right. It's a question of what was their motive here? Why were they trying to form all these connections with the CIA? I think in one end it's like, you want power, so you try to suck up the people who do have power. Mm-hmm. But it's also like, Dennis King, who wrote this book, he, argues that it was basically a scheme to like make friends with people in the CIA, and they figured that if they had enough friends within the CIA and FBI and stuff, they wouldn't be able to get in trouble for all the racketeering they were doing.
I see.
And so make friends with spooks and stay out of jail type strategy. Yeah. So I think it's a bit of both. I think he was genuinely like trying to like form this private intelligence network that he would, be able to use to traffic information and try to like, use this to like maneuver into more powerful situations. And so basically, you're going to make an alliance with the deep state, but also we can do all this like fraud and racketeering stuff and basically, stay out of jail.
Yeah. And that sounds in line with the rest of LaRouche's entire approach and his sort of egomania, especially the first explanation as far as wanting to be around power, wanting to have connections, always kind of looking for his next project, his next little scam, his next little thing where he can be at the top and controlling what's going on. And so it's completely in line with his psychology to want to reach out to powerful agencies, get his fingers into various things, and see what he can do with those connections.
Exactly. It's all about an ego trip with him, and it's like you look at all the crazy twists and turns that the LaRouche movement has made since its foundation, and it doesn't make any sense. There's no consistency, but there is one consistency, which is that the LaRouche movement needs to get into power to save humanity from the ultimate demise, and only the LaRouche movement is able to do this.
Right.
Like, that's really the only consistency you find, and it's totally just a cult-like egomania, like you said.
Totally. And I think that's one of the lessons we can draw from all of this, just as an aside, is any person or any organization claiming, especially on the left and just in our sort of terms, claiming to solely speak for true Marxism, anybody that's propping themselves up as a great man or somebody who understands things at a higher level than anybody else should immediately raise every eyebrow in the room. And we are living in a period where we can see real life left-wing cults emerge, do insane controversial things and dissipate or get destroyed or whatever it may be. Black Hammer and the CPI are two recent examples of this, but it's very fascinating to study the history of left-wing cults before seeing them emerge in our own time, and then seeing them emerge and being able to draw connections between them.
Exactly. We're in 1986, okay. And LaRouche has several offices raided, and multiple indictments are issued for credit card fraud and obstruction of justice. There have been multiple lawsuits issued against LaRouche before then, but they always lawyered up and were able to defeat them, and through a mix of legal tactics and just insane harassment campaigns using their cult. But they actually get him for good in 1988. They actually are able to get him in a short trial, and LaRouche ends up going to prison in 1989 for mail fraud, tax evasion, and other related crimes. And he spends 5 years in prison. Eventually he gets paroled. But what's interesting is while he's in prison, the LaRouche movement keeps on going. He even runs for president from prison, but the group actually tries to form an alliance with right-wing Catholics while LaRouche is in prison, and apparently they get really into Catholicism and really into the doctrine, mm-hmm. and become their big thing. And when LaRouche gets out of prison, he's wait, this is not close enough to my teachings and what I'm really about. You're getting too interested in this Catholicism stuff, and that's taking away from studying my teachings and following my ideas. And so there's a big purge of all the Catholics. And LaRouche reasserts his control over his group, and they keep going into what they have become today.
And what have they become today?
All right, well, so LaRouche dies in 2019, as I said. And
at the age of 96, it's insane
yes,
how long these people live.
His 100th birthday was actually just recently, the day that Queen Elizabeth died, which is quite hilarious.
And the same age, they both died at 96 too. Wow.
Yeah, it's honestly just a weird irony of history. I don't know what was going on there, but funny. So yeah, it cracks me up thinking that all the LaRouche people today were celebrating his birthday and then get the news that the Queen is dead.
Yeah.
I can't imagine a better feeling that they must have had. They must have felt so good.
And it's important just to reiterate for people that might have forgotten how high of a position Queen Elizabeth held in LaRouchean conspiracy theories, the top of the British Empire, a drug peddler. He would make these accusations on mainstream American television that the Queen of England is a drug pusher. So that connection is why it's so.
Yeah, the world's number one dope dealer. He had a whole book called Dope Inc., which is his big expose of the international drug trade with Queen Elizabeth at the top.
Right.
And it's maybe there is some truth to that. Maybe the royal monarchy was involved in the drug trade to some extent, but I highly doubt, it was the extent that they claimed, know. Because we do know that the CIA was involved in the drug trade, and that, official imperialist power does have involvement in the drug trade. But it's if everything with LaRouche, but whenever they do kind of put their pulse on something reasonable, it's just shit coated with so much other nonsense that it's not even really worth dealing with.
And when I saw interviews with him, he would level the accusation of drug peddler against multiple enemies, like anybody that was shitting on him or critiquing him, or whoever was being brought up as somebody who was opposing him. He would consistently the first thing he would come out of his mouth is that person's a drug pusher, or that person's involved with drugs. It's a weird obsession of his.
And like when they were campaigning in like these rural like Midwest places, to win elections, they would always their big campaign promise would be that we're gonna have the death penalty for dope pushers, and we're gonna clean up the streets and do a real war on drugs.
Duterte style.
Yeah, basically, it's basically it became very much focused on anti-drug, anti-counterculture. Like the Beatles were a psyop experiment designed by the Queen of England and the Tavistock Institute to, destroy the mind of the youth, So, it's very much trying to appeal to American conservatives and stuff with this kind of stuff. But nowadays, LaRouche, dies in 2019. And so, but at the time LaRouche had died, they had basically pivoted towards supporting Russia and China. Very interestingly, basically, their big thing, their big selling point in the 90s, they came up with this idea of the world land bridge, where basically we're going to use a kind of state developmental world banking system to unite Russia, China, Brazil, and India with the United States to build a global land bridge that will connect the entire world with one big infrastructure project, and it's going to bring peace to the world by getting everyone to economically cooperate. And so now it's the LaRouche people, their big thing is promoting China's Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah.
Because they see the Belt and Road Initiative as basically their version of LaRouche's land bridge idea. And they kind of tried to hint that actually we came up with it or whatever.
Xi is copying our homework.
Yeah. And when the whole Ukraine crisis broke out with Russia, they were big on being pro-Putin and supporting Putin. They formed connections with this Russian economist Sergei Glazeyev, who's apparently pretty influential on Putin. And so they basically kind of in a way reinvent themselves as almost an anti-imperialist group.
What was their feelings towards Trump? Because I know LaRouche died in 2019, so he had a few years under Trump. Did they take any position?
At first they were anti-Trump and they thought it was all a scam from the elite or whatever. Uh-huh. But then they kind of warmed up to Trump, but they still had ambiguous views on him. And this would complicate things. There was a split after LaRouche died, because the LaRouche movement is composed of several different organizations, and they just all move money between them, and it's all just this whole patchwork of front groups and different stuff like that. And so they have split where the LaRouche PAC wing of the movement basically takes a hard pro-Trump stance. And they're actually the people that I've encountered in real life, campaigning for Trump. They basically just come off as a pro-MAGA group. But the other wing, the wing that is probably the legitimate followers of LaRouche, because his wife is the leader basically. Mm-hmm. They have a more ambiguous relationship with Trump. They'll criticize him for anti-China stuff, but they'll kind of support him against the deep state or whatever. They'll kind of take this position of the MAGA movement is itself it has potential of being a way of reinvigorating America, but it's being misled by whoever their big enemies are. Sure. So I think that's it's complicated. They have an ambiguous relationship towards Trump, but it's still you can see that they do try to appeal to MAGA people and stuff.
Because we see kind of in the current PATSOC movement, I thought at first it was sort of an ironic praising of Trump, kind of using God Emperor, Trump memes, etc., dark MAGA. Then that started, it was all kind of, at first it was kind of ironic, and now at least some segments of that formation have now more or less unironically accepted MAGA and are on the Trump train. It's fucking fascinating to watch.
It's just absolutely ludicrous. Yeah. But like, because the whole LaRouche mindset, the way it works is like it's all about this like struggle between different conspiracies of the elite, right?
Yeah.
So it makes sense that they could like see MAGA as like, you know, maybe like split between the two conspiracies of the elite, right? And so Trump himself is like, you know, split between like humanist forces and oligarch forces. And so like the LaRouche movement needs to like intervene to like, you know, provide the proper leadership to MAGA, basically.
Okay.
And so for them, their big thing is like, we need to get the MAGA people to like support an alliance with Russia and China to, you know, do the Belt and Road Initiative. And so, you know, and they've been on Chinese TV and stuff all the time talking about the Belt and Road Initiative. Like Helena Zepp LaRouche is supposedly known as Miss Belt and Road or whatever in China. That's what they say online. I don't know how true that is, but
and from China's perspective, it's just a novelty that Americans are so vociferously for their policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just pure opportunism on the part of China. They see, oh, here's some Americans who are supporting what we want. Yeah. So let's, you know, use them.
Yeah. Interesting.
You know, and they probably do like, you know, have some intelligence connections, you know, they kind of, because, you know, maybe they do have like some intelligence work stuff that they offer to the Chinese. Like, they have a magazine called Executive Intelligence Review. And this has been like a big thing with LaRouche since the 70s. It was like their big kind of pride and joy was their intelligence magazine. And like it costs like, I don't know, $400 for a subscription, but it's like supposedly where they have like all the really good stuff, you know, all the like really like, you know, niche like intelligence stuff. And but they also have like you know, they'll do like intelligence work just like, you know, per hire. Like I imagine like some of these governments be like, oh, we'll throw you some money if you can find us some information on this connection of you, you know.
I see. Yeah.
Which is like a reason to just not be involved with these people at all, because you know that like anything they you know, learn about you, they're willing to like sell to like other people, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Because like their only allegiance ultimately is to themselves, you know. So in the end, like their interest in China and then their interest in the Belt and Road Initiative, like in the end, like it's just because they see that as like a way to like get closer to power and somehow you know, maneuver their way into a more powerful position. It's in a way like it's like, as I call it, it's a private intelligence racketeering cult.
And today there's no, is there even any semblance of them pretending to be on the left, or is that just completely jettisoned?
Well, you know, I think, you know, because the whole pro-China stuff and the whole pro-Russia stuff, like they are able to like make points that would appeal to leftists, right? Like they're not entirely wrong in all their propaganda today. Like they'll talk about the war in Ukraine and how, you know, the West has, you know, provoked Russia into this war and how NATO is bad.
Yeah.
You know, they're really anti-NATO now, even though in the 70s they were literally like campaigning in Sweden to join NATO.
Out of anti-communism?
Out of anti-communism, yeah.
Interesting.
So, but now they're like campaigning against Sweden joining NATO. And, you know, so I think it's, you know, and I actually like, I had an argument with one of their main guys, Daniel Burke, on Twitter, and I was just like, well, any reasonable point that the LaRouche people make can like be found in Marxism without the insane shit coding.
Yeah, exactly.
And he was like, well, we have communists in our movement. So I think they have been making overtures to the left again, especially to people who are disillusioned with the existing left, especially with the failure of Bernie and the kind of a lot of disillusionment after the whole like summer of 2020 and all the insurrections that went on there. There's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of ideological confusion. There's a lot of contradictions in the left. And we're in a really tough time, you know, as a movement. And so I think that a lot of people, like, you know, they fall prey to a lot of this, like, kind of culty recruitment stuff because of the existing contradictions in the left and stuff.
And I also think there's a little bit of, like, being blown around by the winds of cultural change. Like, You know, if you just live long enough on the left, there's periods of time where the left, like in 2020, for example, seems, hey, we're getting to our feet, and there's times when we feel like, oh, you know, everything's stacked against us. It's a particularly dark period, and these kind of oscillate. And, you know, principled Marxists or people that are rooted in values and a tradition and an analysis keeps them rooted. You know, they weather those storms. But if you're a new leftist, there's nothing wrong with that, or you're just a disaffected Bernie guy, but the winds then move right, and you see yourself being blown to the right. And then, oh, now there's more lefties who are interested in this. Maybe we can reach out, and now there's some communists in our organization. It's very it's very flippant. It's very, you know, arbitrary, and it's very at the whims of the cultural wind shifts.
Exactly. It's like, you know, when you're a Marxist, and, you know, like you educate yourself about history and theory, and you try to get a kind of a broad historical vision of where you are in the grand scheme of things. And so you see that, like, you know, we're embedded in a struggle that has been going on for, you know, years and years and years, and so much has changed. And, you know, we've had tough times and hard times, but the thing is, the conditions change, and we have to be able to change the conditions while still staying principled and sticking to our cause.
Yeah.
So I think, like, you know, there was a lot of confusion after 2020 with a lot of the ruling class, like, kind of taking up the BLM movement and stuff, and taking up these slogans, and like trying to do like what they call woke capital. And then you have like the whole MAGA movement, like, you know, they do the Capitol riot. And so I feel like a lot of people kind of think like, oh, well, the revolutionary energy is there. You know, that's where the real, like, you know, dialectical contradiction is. You know, that's where the real action is. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, there's been this, and a lot of people find that appeal. And I think like if you have that broader historical understanding of things, you know that like the left has tried to do that kind of stuff in the past and has completely failed. And that these kind of like demagogic, like populist figures are not friends of the working class, even when they make like decent points.
Yes.
You know, even when they say the FBI is bad or talk about the role of the CIA in corrupting democracy or whatever, like they don't have your best interests at heart, you know?
Absolutely. I think that's incredibly well said. When I criticized that Hinkle guy on Twitter for his MAGA Marxist tweet, somebody in the replies is like, you know, Breht, I really like and respect you. I just wanted to say, like, you know, he might not be perfect, or, you know, Hinkle might be wrong in these various ways, but, you know, he is right about the Democrats, and he is right about Russia and Ukraine. And my response is like, yeah, lots of people on the new and the alt-right are right more or less on the Russia-Ukraine shit, and anybody with half a brain can criticize the Democratic Party. These are not core Marxist principles, and these are not things that make somebody a Marxist or not a Marxist. You could have right-wing articulations of these exact same things. In and of themselves, they are meaningless. And, you know, I think that's something that can hook some people, is like, well, on this issue and this issue and this issue, they seem so right. So then, you know, I'm more willing to buy in on this other shit that is increasingly Looney Tunes, you know, but it feels like, well, they're at least they're rooted in something that's somewhat right. I don't know. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon in and of itself.
Yeah. It's like, you know, Caleb Maupin's CPI is interesting because, you know, Caleb Maupin was a Marxist. You know, he was in the Workers' World Party for quite some time. And his ideology, you know, he's not really like in public. I don't know what he's doing right now, like, because he got exposed in a sex scandal that made him look really bad. And a lot of his own supporters have completely like turned on him, rightfully so. You know, because he's just turned out to be even more of a scumbag than we realized. But you know, he was and I've heard from various sources that he's been with LaRouche people for 10 years. You know, even when he was, I think so. You know, he's had those connections with the LaRouche movement for a while. And like I said, he's a Marxist in a lot of ways still. But like all the places where he breaks from Marxism are LaRouche talking points, like the whole anti-environmentalism stuff, the whole like synthetic left stuff. Like there's a bunch of like all the ways that Caleb Maupin's like Marxism, quote unquote, is unique, is basically all just LaRouche talking points.
Absolutely.
Which is interesting because I've always wondered, like, I have no idea either way. It's like, well, is Caleb Maupin himself a LaRoucheist who's like part of like one of their later schemes to like recruit leftists? Or is he just like, you know, doing his own kind of thing, but like in league with the LaRouche people, and they kind of like are trying different approaches? Like, I don't know. There's something weird going on there.
Yeah. But opportunists of all stripes will always find some fertile ground in this attempt to, tail reaction, dress it up as the left, do these attempts at whatever, red-brown alliances or the ushering in of right-wing conspiratorial bullshit into left-wing rhetoric or whatever it may be. As long as politics exists, there's going to be people trying to fill in those spots on the political spectrum and make a name for themselves and opportunistically grab at that opportunity. And so, one of the things that an episode like this is supposed to do, and I think Donald and me both agree on this, is to help people, whether you're new to the left, a veteran, or somewhere in between. This has happened before. There's nothing new under the sun. This is a reinvention of a wheel. And by going back and studying closely how these previous manifestations of this exact same current, lived and died and where they led, we can learn a lot about our present conditions. And if you don't know that, you're much more susceptible, especially if you're new to the left, by being won in by these people,
Yeah, definitely.
Well, we're coming up on over an hour and a half, in between an hour and a half and 2 hours here, and I think we covered everything we wanted to cover in this episode. Is there anything else that you want to say before we wrap up with plugs and recommendations? Any other lessons you think we can draw from this story? Anything at all you want to say before we wrap this up?
Yeah, I think in the end, it's not just that these kind of alliances are right and never lead anywhere good. It's also that if you just have to beware of overly charismatic figures who seem to think that their intellectual talents are the key to the world being saved itself. And I think Marxism is supposed to be, at least parts of Marxism are supposed to be scientific, right? We're trying to develop a scientific understanding of the world, and we're trying to act on that understanding to change the world in a positive way. But if someone isn't willing to be criticized and have their theories be put up to scrutiny from other people in the name of scientific improvement, then you're probably not dealing with someone who's doing science. You're probably dealing with a demagogic, cult-like figure, basically.
Absolutely.
And I think you see that tendency all throughout the Marxist left, is sectarian groups that aren't willing to engage with other leftist groups in criticism and to learn from other leftist groups and kind of seeing their own group as the perfect vanguard that doesn't need to work with anyone else, or if they do work with anyone else, it's always got to be on their terms only. And I don't sound like an anarchist here, because I'm not against the idea of a vanguard, and of course I'm very much for building a party and uniting intellectuals in the workers' movement and stuff. But I think that you just have to watch out for those kind of tendencies.
Absolutely.
And another thing I would add also that doesn't get talked about as much is the amount of sexual abuse that women in the LaRouche movement were put through. It's it gets talked about in some of the sources I've read, but there was just a lot of misogyny and patriarchy and domestic abuse going on. So I think there's something to be said about that as well, in the way that it's very much a kind of paternalistic, patriarchal kind of dynamic going on with a lot of these types.
Yeah. And if somebody expresses bigotry in one area, the odds that they also have problematic or retrograde or shitty views in another area are pretty high. So if somebody's railing against LGBTQ people or trans people in particular, the chances that they're going to be super good feminists and show solidarity with other races goes down dramatically. And those errors permeate and destroy entire organizations, as we've seen time and time again.
Right.
And one thing I wanted to say, too, that kind of bouncing off what you said, Donald, is the importance. Of course, we should always be suspicious of any individuals claiming to have superior knowledge, egomaniacs of all sorts, but there also needs to be a stress on communal analysis. No one person understands all of anything. No one person understands all of Marxism, and no one person can apply Marxism perfectly all the time. And so what the best sort of hedge against this sort of cultish behavior, this turn towards reaction, is to be wedded to an organization that can keep you accountable, to have a de-emphasis on individual egos in favor of an emphasis on communal activity, all of us coming together, and of course tried and true ways of staying connected to the working class, like, let's say, the mass line, these organizing tactics that have been tried throughout, history in many different locations and have shown to be successful, and shows how it ties organizations to communities and real material interest of people in those communities. Because when you're completely devoid from that, when you're completely untethered from, the real life day-to-day struggles of regular working people, you can float off into the clouds in any number of directions. And I think that's something to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's really just no alternative to democratic organizing, Like, that's really, like, what the left has failed in a lot of ways since, like, the 1960s and 70s. I think a lot of, like, Leninist groups have failed to understand the importance of, like, having democratic accountability and having democratic structures in organizations, and not creating a system that lends itself to a cult of personality of any kind. Like, communal analysis, like you said, is exactly what we need. We don't need, one really smart guy who's figured it all out, who's mastered, all the secrets of the universe and discovered the, all the new theories we need. We need people like that who are smart and have interesting ideas and compelling ideas, but they need to be embedded in a movement that keeps them, like, kind of grounded and as one of many other people who are, exploring these problems and engaging in a scientific dialogue.
Exactly right. Well, my friend, this has been a fascinating trip through a really interesting figure, organization, and chunk of left-wing history, or just political history in general. Really appreciate you coming on. Always have been a fan of your work. I still continue to be, and I even plug when I go on other shows. I think recently I went on another show and plugged Cosmonaut Magazine, because I really do appreciate the principled stuff that comes out of that outlet. So before I let you go, though, do you have anything to plug, any recommendations for people that might want to learn more? Anything else you want to say before we wrap up?
Well, firstly, likewise, thanks for having me on, comrade. I love your stuff too. I guess I would just say, check out cosmonautmag.com. That's really, that's, the big project I put a lot of work into. And I think, a lot of people, have said it's useful. So I think it'll be useful for your listeners as well. We have a podcast, and we have, articles, and we try to promote debate and actual dialogue amongst the left. And, I think, our project serves that kind of purpose. And I think, our goal is to, work with the rest of the left and to engage in that kind of dialogue rather than kind of sequestering ourselves off into a sectarian group. And so I think, hopefully we do accomplish something like that. But again, thanks for having me on, Brad. It's my pleasure. I also want to say real quick, I recommend, people, like, look into this stuff and look into the sources on this stuff and then go deeper into it, because, like, I barely scratched the surface of how crazy this stuff gets.
Yeah, definitely.